Humiliated and homeless, he turned a rocky gorge into an underground forge. Reuben Pike, who had survived 15 winters in these hills and buried 2 drovers to the cold, warned him. "Your children will die in that rock before January is out." He had $38, 2 children, and needed shelter he could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature crashed 50 degrees by nightfall. But 7 months earlier, Milo Harwood had never roofed stone in his life. He'd spent 23 years working iron. He knew how to draw a bar to a point, how to upset a rod for a rivet head, how to judge cherry red from orange and orange from yellow. He could shoe a draft horse in 14 minutes and turn a broken wagon tire into a sound one before the teamster finished his coffee. What Milo Harwood did not know in May of 1887 was how to keep a roof over his children's heads when the roof no longer belonged to him. The foreclosure papers had arrived on the 12th. By the 15th, Cyrus Dake's men had driven away the last of the cattle, 63 head, all that remained of what had once been nearly 400. The house, the corrals, the barn with the new shingle roof Milo had laid himself 2 summers before, all of it reverted to the bank. What Dake left him was what the law required and nothing more. His personal tools, 1 wagon, 1 anvil, and $38 in coin. Milo stood in the empty yard and watched the dust settle behind the departing herd. Ruth stood beside him, 13 years old and silent. Perry, 8, had stopped crying an hour ago and now simply held his father's hand with both of his own, as if afraid Milo might vanish too. "Where do we go?" Ruth asked. Milo had no answer. He had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1879 with his wife Clara and a 2-year-old Ruth, chasing the same promise that had pulled thousands into the Black Hills after Custer's expedition found gold. But Milo had not come for gold. He had come because gold made men need blacksmiths, and blacksmiths could charge whatever the traffic would bear. For 8 years, it had worked. He had shod horses for miners, repaired wagon tongues for freighters, forged picks and drills and hinges and chains. He had saved enough to buy cattle when the northern range opened up, when Texas steers bought for $4 could be fattened on free grass and sold for 40 in Chicago. Clara had died bringing Perry into the world. One end Milo had buried her on the ridge above French Creek, where she could see the sunrise. Then he had buried himself in work, first the smithing, then the cattle, then the desperate mathematics of a herd that kept shrinking through 2 brutal winters, while his note to Dake kept growing. Now the mathematics had won. The town of Custer City had grown around the stage route and the supply trade, a scatter of frame buildings and false fronts serving miners headed into the hills and ranchers working the grasslands to the east. Milo had been a fixture there for 8 years. He had shod horses for every freighter on the Cheyenne Road. He had made hinges for the schoolhouse and repaired the church bell when it cracked. But credit in a freight and supply town was a public matter. By the time Milo walked into Hendrix's general store 3 days after the foreclosure, everyone knew. "Cash only," Hendrix said without meeting his eyes. "I have cash." "For how long?" Milo bought lamp oil, flour, salt, and a small sack of dried apples. He did not buy nails. He could not afford them. When he left, he heard the murmur of conversation resume behind him, the sound of his life being discussed by people who had once called him neighbor. Reuben Pike found him at the edge of town, loading the supplies into the wagon. Pike was a freighter, a man who had spent 15 winters hauling goods between Cheyenne and Deadwood. He had the face of someone who had seen cold kill, and he had 2 drovers buried in shallow graves along the route, their bodies not found until spring thaw. See, he was also the closest thing Milo had to a friend, which was why he could say what he said next. "Where are you planning to winter?" Milo cinched the rope around the flour sack. I'll find something. Find what? You've got no house, no barn, no team worth the name. That mare won't last a hard season. You've got 30-some dollars and 2 children, and winter comes in 5 months. What exactly are you going to find? I don't know yet. Pike stepped closer. His voice dropped, not from discretion, but from the weight of what he was saying. Listen to me. I've seen men try to winter in this country without proper shelter. I've seen what it does to them. A decent house, a real house, 16 by 20, weather-tight, with 2 stoves and window glass. That's $300 if you build it yourself and have a team to haul the logs. You don't have $300. You don't have a team. I know. And firewood. 8 cords minimum if you want to be safe. You know what it takes to cut and split and stack 8 cords? With no help? With 2 children who can't swing an axe worth a damn? I know. Then tell me your plan. Milo finally looked at him. I told you. I don't have one yet. Pike shook his head slowly. Milo, I buried Jacob Went in '83 because he thought he could winter in a half-finished dugout. I buried Silas Crenshaw in '85 because he ran out of wood in February and tried to burn green pine. Men die in this country when they don't have what they need, and what they need is more than you've got. Then what would you have me do? Put Ruth and Perry on a stage to Cheyenne? Give them to strangers? I won't do it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to face the truth. You need to find someone to take you in for the winter. Work for your keep. Share a roof. Who's going to take in a broke rancher with 2 children? Who's going to feed 3 extra mouths through a Black Hills winter out of the goodness of their heart? Pike was silent. That's what I thought. Milo climbed onto the wagon seat. I appreciate you being honest with me, Reuben, but I'm going to figure this out. I have to. Pike watched him gather the reins. Then he said the words that would echo in Milo's mind for months to come. Sleep in rock if you like, Harwood, but your children will die in it before January is out. Milo said nothing. He flicked the reins and drove the wagon out of town, east toward the Gorge, where he had sometimes set up a temporary forge when working for the mining camps to the south. Behind him, Custer City went about its business. Ahead, the Black Hills rose against the sky, indifferent to the mathematics of survival. The gorge cut into the granite hills about 4 miles south of town, a narrow slash where French Creek had carved through the stone over thousands of years before finding an easier path. The walls rose 18 feet on either side, rough and gray and streaked with lichen. At the widest point, the gap measured perhaps 20 feet. At the narrow end, it pinched down to barely 8. Milo had used this place before. 2 summers ago, he had set up a temporary forge here to handle overflow work from a mining outfit that had struck a promising vein. The work had lasted 6 weeks, and in that time, he had noticed something. The gorge stayed cool in the afternoon heat when the rest of the hills baked. The stone held the morning chill well into the day. Now he noticed something else. He had built a small fire against the east wall to heat water for coffee. The flames crackled and popped, the smoke rising straight up in the still air. He let the fire burn while he unloaded the wagon, while he set up the canvas tarp that would serve as shelter until he figured out something better. An hour passed. The fire died to coals. Another hour. The coals went gray. Milo pressed his hand against the rock face. It was warm, not hot. The fire had been small, but the stone had absorbed the heat and was giving it back slowly, steadily, like a stove that had been banked for the night. He moved his hand higher, above where the flames had reached. Cool granite, lower, where the fire had burned. Warmth. He stood there for a long time, thinking. A blacksmith's forge could reach 2,000 degrees. He had spent his life working with heat, understanding how metal absorbed it and released it. He knew that a thick piece of iron, heated properly, would stay workable long after it left the fire, while a thin piece cooled in seconds. Mass mattered. Thickness mattered. The denser the material, the more heat it could hold. Granite was dense. These walls were thick, and they went down into the earth, where the temperature stayed constant year-round, neither freezing in winter nor baking in summer. He had heard old miners talk about it, how the deep tunnels stayed the same temperature regardless of the weather above. The mathematics of shelter began to shift in his mind. Your house required walls, a roof, windows, a floor, 2 stoves, and 8 cords of wood to burn. The walls leaked heat. The roof leaked heat. The windows, even with glass, bled warmth into the winter air. The stoves fought a losing battle against the cold pressing in from every direction. But a space carved into rock, or rather, a space roofed across rock, would behave differently. 2 walls were already there, and they were thick. They did not leak. They did not need maintenance. They were not vulnerable to wind. If he could roof the gap and close the ends, he would have a shelter with only one surface exposed to the weather, the roof itself. And if he put a forge inside, a working forge, the kind he would need anyway to earn his keep through the winter, then the heat from his work would not escape through 4 flimsy walls, but it would be absorbed by the stone, stored, released slowly through the night, the way the hot coals of his morning fire were still warming the rock face now. The idea was absurd. He knew that. Reuben Pike would call it suicide. Cyrus Dake would call it proof that Milo Harwood had lost his mind along with his cattle. But the mathematics were different from what everyone assumed. He could not afford to heat a house in a shop. What if the shop was the house? Owen Blevins came by 3 days later. Blevins was a carpenter, a lean and methodical man who had built half the frame structures in Custer City. He had also bid on the job of constructing Milo's barn, back when Milo still had money to pay for barns. Now he arrived on horseback, ostensibly to see if Milo needed help moving his things to wherever he was going. What he found instead was Milo measuring the gorge with a length of rope. "What are you doing?" "Measuring." "I can see that. Measuring for what?" Milo wrote a number on the scrap of paper he carried. "Roof span, 18 feet at the widest point. It narrows to 8 at the far end." Blevins dismounted slowly. He walked to the edge of the gorge and looked down into the gap. "You're not thinking what I think you're thinking. Depends on what you think I'm thinking. I think you're thinking about roofing this gorge like a dugout and living in it through the winter. Then you're thinking right." Blevins was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who has seen many bad ideas and recognizes another. "Milo, I like you. I always have. But this is lunacy." "Why?" "Because," Blevins gestured at the gorge, "because an 18-foot span is beyond what peeled logs can carry without sagging. Because any roof you put over this will collect snow and collapse before February. Because the floor is bare rock, and you can't drain water from bare rock, and the first hard rain will turn this into a cistern. Because smoke doesn't rise through sod and clay, it pools at the lowest point and suffocates anyone stupid enough to sleep there. Because," he stopped, shaking his head, "because it won't work. It can't work. I've built in this country for 9 years. I know what stands and what falls." "And if I addressed every one of those concerns?" "You can't. If I reduce the span by building in from the walls, if I use thicker logs and more of them, if I cut drainage into the floor before I laid anything else, if I built proper flues the way a smelter would with low air intake and rising chimneys." Blevins stared at him. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 days. It still won't work. It might. And if it doesn't, if the roof sags or the drainage fails or the smoke kills your children in their sleep? Milo met his gaze. If I do nothing, my children freeze to death in a canvas tent sometime in December. At least this gives us a chance. Blevins looked down at the gorge again. The morning sun was hitting the east wall, warming the gray stone. After a long moment, he said, "Show me what you're planning, the whole thing, floor to roof." Milo showed him. He talked for an hour, sketching in the dirt, explaining each piece of the design. The floor would be cut below grade and slope toward a sump at the narrow end. Any water that entered would drain to a single point where it could be bailed or channeled out. The roof would not be a single span across the full 18 feet. Instead, Milo would build supporting ribs from the walls inward, reducing the free span to something manageable. The logs would be peeled ponderosa, laid tight, covered with brush and clay, and then sawed, the same method that had roofed thousands of prairie dugouts. The front wall would be a combination of stone and salvaged planks, with a proper door and a windlock to prevent drafts. The rear wall would be tighter, nearly solid, with only a small access point for the chimney flues. And the forges, 3 of them, eventually, would run every day. Barter work. The same work Milo had done for 23 years. Horseshoes, wagon repairs, pick sharpening, hinge making. The work would generate heat. The heat would be absorbed by the stone. The stone would release it slowly through the night. When he finished, Blevins stood without speaking for a long time. "The drainage might work," he finally said. "Maybe, if you cut it deep enough and keep the outflow clear. The roof span." He shook his head. 18 feet is too much. Even 12 is pushing it without proper supports. "I'll build supports." "With what? You've got no milled lumber. You've got 1 anvil and a wagon and $30-some dollars. You can't buy supports." "I'll build them out of stone, pillar by pillar if I have to." "That's months of work." "I have months. What I don't have is another option." Blevins looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "You're going to kill yourself, or your children, or all 3 of you." "Maybe. But you're going to do it anyway." "Yes." Blevins mounted his horse. "I'll come back in a week. If you're still alive and still working, I'll bring you some scrap lumber. Not enough to matter, but enough to help with the front wall." "Why?" Blevins smiled grimly. "Because I've been wrong before. Once or twice." He turned the horse toward town. "Don't die before I get back. I'd hate to miss seeing how this turns out." The news of Milo Harwood's plan spread through Custer City within days. Cyrus Dake heard it first from his clerk, who had heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who had heard it from Blevins himself. Dake set down his pen and listened with the expression of a man watching a debtor confirm every suspicion he had ever harbored. "A cave," the clerk said. "He's roofing a gorge and planning to live in it with his children." "Of course he is." "They're calling it Harwood's Stone Coffin." "A fitting name." Dake returned to his ledger. "Let him dig his grave. It will save someone the trouble of digging it for him come spring." But Dake was not content to simply watch. A man who fails quietly, after all, is merely unfortunate. A man who fails spectacularly, who drags his children into a rock-walled death trap against all advice, becomes a warning to others who might think themselves exempt from the laws of prudent finance. Dake began, in his quiet way, to apply pressure. First, the charcoal burner. So Milo had been buying charcoal from a man named Krieger, who operated a pit 3 miles east of town. Krieger had agreed to extend credit, taking his payment in repair work once the forge was running. A week after Milo began work on the Gorge, Krieger arrived to deliver a different message. "I can't do it," he said, not meeting Milo's eyes. "I'm sorry. I need the cash up front." "What changed?" "Nothing changed. I need the cash." Milo understood. He did not ask who had spoken to Krieger or what had been said. He simply nodded, thanked the man for coming in person, and watched him leave. Then the general store. Hendricks, who had already demanded cash, now refused to sell to Milo at all, not even for cash. "Find another store," he said. "I can't afford the trouble." "What trouble?" Hendricks glanced toward the back room, where his wife was minding the ledgers. "Just find another store." Then the lumber mill. Milo had hoped to buy offcuts and scrap, the pieces too small or too crooked for proper construction, usually sold cheap or given away. The mill owner, a German named Schreiber, had always been willing to deal. Now he shook his head before Milo even finished asking. "I'm sorry," Schreiber said. "I can't sell to you." "Why?" "Because I can't." Schreiber's jaw tightened. "Because some men in this town have more say than others in how business gets done, and I have a family to feed too." Milo understood that as well. Dake was not simply waiting for him to fail. Dake was making certain that he would. Milo returned to the gorge and looked at what he had. One wagon, one anvil, a handful of tools, a canvas tarp for shelter. Note 2 children who watched him with eyes that trusted him to find a way. He could not buy charcoal. He would make his own, using slash pine from the slopes above the gorge and the same pit-burning method he had seen in Kentucky as a boy. He could not buy lumber. He would work with stone and with whatever scrap he could salvage from abandoned claims and collapsed structures throughout the hills. He could not buy supplies from Hendricks. He would travel farther, to stores in Buffalo Gap, where Dake's reach was thinner. And he would work. That was the one thing no one could take from him. The skill in his hands, the knowledge in his head, the ability to turn raw iron into useful things that people needed badly enough to pay for. If he could get the forge running, if he could offer repairs and fabrication to the freighters and miners and ranchers who had no other option within easy reach, then he could barter for what he needed. Charcoal for horseshoes, food for hinges, cloth and blankets for wagon tire resets. The town wanted him to fail. Dake needed him to fail. But failure required that he stop working, and Milo Harwood had never stopped working in his life. He picked up a shovel and began cutting drainage into the floor of the gorge. The first week was drainage work alone. Milo cut a channel from the high end of the gorge to the low end, following the natural slope of the rock. Where the granite was soft enough, he chiseled. Where it was too hard, he heated it with fire and then threw water on it to crack the surface. Was the way he had seen miners do when breaking ground. The channel was 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep. Not much, but enough to carry rainfall toward the sump. Ruth helped where she could, carrying buckets of rubble to the growing pile outside the gorge. Perry hauled water from French Creek, a quarter-mile distant, filling the barrel strapped to the wagon bed. They worked from first light until dark, and by the end of the 7th day, the drainage channel was complete. The sump was a hole 3 feet across and 4 feet deep, chiseled into the lowest point of the floor. Any water that entered the gorge, rain, snowmelt, or simple condensation would flow toward that hole. Milo could bail it by hand or, eventually, channel it through a gap in the front wall. "Will it work?" Ruth asked, standing at the edge of the sump. "It should. And if it doesn't, then we'll dig deeper." She nodded, accepting this. Ruth had her mother's practicality, her willingness to face bad odds without complaint. Perry was different. He needed to believe things would work out. needed hope the way he needed air. Milo gave him hope. To Ruth, he gave honesty. "We're going to test it tonight," he said. "If it rains, we'll see how the drainage handles it. If it doesn't rain, we'll pour water in ourselves and watch where it goes." It rained. The storm came in from the northwest just after dark, a summer thunderstorm of the kind common in the hills, hard rain, brief and violent, then nothing. Milo stood at the mouth of the gorge and watched the water come. It ran down the slopes above, found the gap, and poured through. For a terrifying moment, he thought it would overwhelm the channel, flood the floor, and prove Blevins right. But the channel held. The water ran along the groove he had cut, racing toward the sump, filling it within minutes. Milo waded in and began bailing, bucket after bucket, throwing the water out through the gap in the front stones he had not yet sealed. Ruth joined him, then Perry. For 2 hours they bailed by lantern light while the rain hammered the canvas above their makeshift sleeping area. By midnight the storm had passed. The sump was half full but draining now through the natural cracks in the rock. The floor of the gorge was wet but not flooded. The channel had worked. Milo sat down on a flat stone and breathed. His back ached. His hands were raw from the shovel. But the drainage worked. 1 test passed. 100 more to come. The second week brought the first roof logs. Milo had found a stand of ponderosa pine 2 miles north, on land that belonged to no one in particular, part of the vast federal holdings that stretched across the hills. He felled the trees with a borrowed axe, stripped the bark with a draw knife, and dragged them back to the gorge one at a time behind his failing mare. Each log weighed more than he could lift alone. Each one took most of a day to harvest and transport. Ruth had taken over the cooking, such as it was. Dried beans, salt pork, and biscuits made from the flour Milo had bought before Hendricks cut him off. Perry's job was to keep the fire going and to watch for snakes in the rocks. The gorge was perfect habitat for rattlers, and they had already killed 3. By the end of the second week, 6 logs lay beside the gorge, but waiting to be placed. Milo needed at least 20 to cover the full 60-foot length of the space. At his current pace, that meant another month of logging before he could begin the roof itself. It was not fast enough. He was losing time he did not have. That was when Owen Blevins returned. He came with a wagon, not a horse, and the wagon was not empty. "Scrap," Blevins said, climbing down. "The Jensen place burned last winter. Family moved to Deadwood. Nobody wanted the debris, so I've been using it for kindling. Figured you could use it for something better." Milo looked at the wagon. Charred planks, some still solid beneath the blackening, twisted nails that could be straightened. Half a door, a window frame with no glass. "Why?" he asked. Blevins shrugged. "Told you I'd been wrong before. Besides," he looked at the gorge, at the drainage channel, at the stacked logs. "You're still here. You're still working. That's more than I expected. Is Dake going to come for you too?" "Probably." Blevins smiled, thin and tired. "But I'm not the one who owes him money. He can make my life harder, but he can't take my livelihood. Not the way he took yours." They unloaded the scrap lumber together, stacking it where it would stay dry. Then Blevins walked into the gorge and studied the channel, the sump, the stone walls rising on either side. "The drainage is better than I thought," he admitted. "Still might not handle a week of hard rain, but for normal weather, it should work." "That's what I figured. The roof is still your problem. An 18-foot span is too much for these logs. Even if you build supports from the walls, you're looking at sagging, cracking, maybe collapse when the snow loads up." "I know. So what's your plan?" Milo pointed at the walls. The gorge isn't 18 feet wide everywhere. At the narrow end, it's only 8. And in the middle, he walked to a spot about 20 feet from the rear. Here, see that shelf? Blevins looked. A natural ledge jutted out from the east wall, perhaps 3 feet wide and running back into the stone. I see it. If I build a stone pillar from the floor to meet that ledge, I've got a natural support. It cuts the span in half. You're going to build a pillar. Out of stone. Yes. Without mortar? Without cut blocks? With bare rock and your bare hands? With dry stacked stone and clay mortar I'll make myself, the same way they built walls in Cornwall before there were brick factories. Blevins stared at him. Where did you learn about Cornish wall building? I haven't yet, Milo said, but I'm going to. The end of July arrived with the first pillar half built and the first crisis looming. Milo had managed to acquire, through barter, enough charcoal to run a small forge for perhaps 2 weeks. He had salvaged enough iron from abandoned claims to make a start on basic work, horseshoes, hinges, nails. But 2 weeks of fuel would not see him through to a functioning operation. He needed more charcoal, and he needed it now. His own charcoal making had proven slower than expected. The pit he had dug yielded small batches of inconsistent quality. Some of the charcoal burned hot and clean. Some of it smoldered and smoked and produced little heat. He was learning, but learning took time he did not have. The mare, too, was failing. She was old, not past 15 by Milo's estimation, and the work of dragging logs had worn her down. Her ribs showed through her coat. Her breathing was labored after even short exertion. She would not last the winter. She might not last the summer. And Ruth had begun coughing. It started small, a tickle in her throat, a dry hack that she attributed to dust from the construction. But by the end of July, the cough had deepened. She was tired all the time, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Milo counted his remaining money. $21. A doctor's visit would cost $3. Medicine, if Ruth needed it, could cost 10 or more. He could not afford it, but he also could not afford to lose her. It's just the dust, Ruth said when he pressed her. I'll be fine when we finish the roof. And if it's not just the dust, then we'll deal with it. She's after. She was so much like Clara. Too much. Milo watched her force herself through another day of work, hauling stone, mixing clay, and carrying water with hands that trembled from exhaustion. He wanted to tell her to rest, to save her strength, to let him handle everything himself. But he could not handle everything himself. That was the brutal truth. Without Ruth's help, the work would slow to a crawl. Without Perry's help, even the smallest tasks would go undone. They were a family of 3 trying to do the work of 10, and they were running out of time. The roof logs were not yet in place. The pillar was half built. The front wall was still just a plan sketched in the dirt. And August was coming, bringing shorter days and the first hints of the season turning toward cold. Milo lay awake at night, yours listening to Ruth cough in her sleep, and wondered if Reuben Pike had been right all along. Sleep in rock if you like, Harwood, but your children will die in it before January is out. He got up before dawn and went back to work. The man who would change everything arrived on the first day of August, leading a mule that looked nearly as broken as he did. Milo was working on the pillar when he heard the animal's hooves on the gravel above the gorge. He set down his hammer and climbed out to find an old man standing at the rim, looking down at the construction with an expression Milo could not read. The man was perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was hard to tell. His face was weathered to the color of old leather, and his hands were thick with calluses that spoke of decades of hard labor. He walked with a pronounced limp, in favoring his right leg, and when he breathed, There was a faint whistle in his chest that Milo recognized as the sound of damaged lungs. "You're Harwood," the man said. It was not a question. "I am. The one building the stone coffin." "That's what they call it." The man nodded slowly. He studied the gorge for a long moment, the drainage channel, the half-built pillar, the stacked logs waiting for placement. Then he picked up a loose stone from the rim, turned it over in his hands, and tossed it down into the gap. It bounced twice and came to rest against the east wall. "Wrong stone," he said. "What?" "That one." He pointed at the pillar. "You're building with the wrong stone. Half of what you've stacked is rotten. It'll crack when the weight comes down." Milo felt his jaw tighten. And you know this how?" The man finally looked at him directly. His eyes were pale blue, nearly colorless, and they held the kind of certainty that came from experience rather than opinion. "Because I spent 31 years underground. Copper and tin in Cornwall, then silver and gold in these hills. I've seen more stone walls than you've seen horseshoes, and I know what holds and what doesn't." "Cornwall." "I, Joanne Trigalis, came over in '58, worked the Comstock, then the hills after the rush. My lungs gave out 3 years ago, my hip 2 years before that. Now I do small jobs, repair work, enough to eat." Milo climbed out of the gorge and stood facing him. "What brings you here?" "Curiosity." Trigalis limped to the edge and looked down again. "They're laughing at you in town, you know. Calling you a fool and a dead man. But I've seen fools before, and you're not building like one. That drainage channel," he pointed. "That's proper work. That's someone who knows water kills underground faster than cold ever will." "I learned that the hard way. First storm nearly flooded the floor." "But it didn't, because you cut the channel first." Trigalis turned to face him. "Most men would have started with the roof, covered the gap, made it look like shelter, then wondered why they were standing in a foot of water come September. You started with the water. That's not foolish. That's Cornish." "I've never been to Cornwall." "No, but you're thinking like someone who has." He paused. "That pillar, though, that's going to kill you." "The pillar is fine." "The pillar is rotten." Trigalis began making his way down the slope into the gorge, moving carefully on his bad leg. Milo followed. When they reached the half-built column of stacked stone, Trigalis pulled a small hammer from his belt, a tool Milo had never seen before, with a narrow head and a long handle, and struck the side of the pillar 3 times in quick succession. The sound was dull, flat, dead. "Hear that?" Trigalis asked. "I hear it. That's rot. The stone sounds dead because it is dead, weathered through, fractured inside, ready to crumble when you load it." He moved to the wall and struck it in 3 places. The first 2 sounded the same, dull, flat. The third rang out clearly, a sharp tone that seemed to hang in the air. "That," Trigalis said, Xiao pointing at the spot that had rung true, "is live rock, solid through. That's what you build with. That's what you trust your children's lives to." Milo stared at the wall, then at the pillar, then at Trigalis. "How do I tell the difference before I stack it?" "You strike it, every piece. If it rings, you use it. If it thuds, you throw it in the ditch." He handed the hammer to Milo. "Here, this is a mine hammer, meant for testing rock. Keep it. I've got another." "Why are you helping me?" Trigalis looked at him for a long moment. "Because you're doing something I've never seen done before. You're trying to survive in rock instead of dying in it. Most men fear stone. You're trying to make it your ally." He glanced around the gorge, the walls rising on either side, the channel running straight to the sump, the logs stacked and waiting. "And because you're going to fail if you don't learn what I know. That pillar would have collapsed by November. The roof would have come down. Your children would have died. You don't know that. I know stone. Trigalis began climbing back up the slope. I'll come back tomorrow. We'll tear down what you've built and start again. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. If you don't. He shrugged. Then I'll watch from town like everyone else and see how long it takes for the mountain to kill you. He climbed onto his mule and rode away without looking back. Milo tore down the pillar the next morning. It took him 3 hours to dismantle what had taken him 2 weeks to build. Every stone he pulled from the stack, he struck with the mine hammer. Dull, dull, dull. Nearly all of it was rotten, just as Trigalis had said. When the old man arrived at midday, the pillar was a scattered pile of rejected rock, and Milo was sitting on the gorge floor with his head in his hands. Good, Trigalis said, surveying the destruction. Now we start properly. He spent the first lesson teaching Milo to listen. Strike the wall, Trigalis said. Not hard, just firm. Let the hammer bounce back instead of pushing through. Milo struck. Dead. Move left. He struck again. Dead. Move left. Again. There. Hear the difference? That's live rock. The sound carries because the stone is whole. Mark it. Milo scratched an X at the spot with a piece of charcoal. Now find the edges. Where does it go dead again? They worked their way along the entire east wall, then the west. By sunset, both walls were marked with dozens of X's indicating the live stone and circles indicating the rotten sections. A pattern emerged. The live rock clustered in bands running diagonally through the granite, while the rotten sections filled the gaps between. The mountain isn't uniform, Trigalis explained. It formed in layers over millions of years. Some layers crystallized tight. Others had air, water, impurities. Time made the weak places weaker. Now you know where to trust your weight and where to stay clear. This must have taken you years to learn. It took me weeks. The rest of the years were learning what to do with what I knew. Trigalis sat down on a flat stone, breathing heavily. The whistle in his chest was louder now, and his face was gray with exhaustion. Tomorrow I'll show you water discipline. That channel is good, but your sump is wrong. The water pools instead of draining. One hard freeze and you'll have ice blocking the outflow. How do I fix it? Deeper and angled differently. I'll show you. He stood slowly. But not today. Today my lungs are finished. He left before Milo could thank him, but he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The second week of August brought the water lesson. Trigalis made Milo deepen the sump by another 2 feet, then angle the outflow trench to run beneath the threshold of the front wall rather than through a gap above it. Water follows gravity, he said. If you put the drain above the floor level, you'll always have water pooling below it. Put the drain at the lowest point, and the water has nowhere to go but out. It was obvious once explained. But Milo would never have thought of it himself. The third lesson was the chimney. Your forge will kill your children if you don't vent it properly, Trigalis said. Underground spaces trap smoke. The hot air rises, hits the ceiling, spreads out, cools, and sinks back down. In a normal room, the smoke goes up and out through a chimney. In a space like this, with a sod roof and stone walls, the smoke has nowhere to go unless you make it a path. He sketched in the dirt, a forge positioned against the rear wall, a flue rising from the fire, channeling through a gap in the roof, extending above the sod so wind could not blow smoke back down. Low intake, he said, pointing. The fire needs air, and cold air is heavy. Cut a gap near the floor, facing away from the prevailing wind. The cold air comes in low, feeds the fire. The hot smoke rises through the flue. If you get the proportions right, the draft does the work for you. What proportions? Trigalis smiled for the first time since they had met. Now you're asking the right questions. He taught Milo the ratios, throat width to flue height, intake size to forge volume, chimney position relative to wind direction. It was not magic, it was mathematics. The same mathematics Milo used when calculating the carbon content of steel, or the heat needed to forge weld two pieces of iron, but applied to air and smoke instead of metal. You learned this in the mines? I learned this in the smelters. Before my lungs went, I ran furnace construction for the homestake operation in Lead. 3 years of building ventilation systems that could handle temperatures you've never seen. He paused. Then my hip broke in a shaft collapse. Then my lungs started bleeding from the dust. Now I'm an old man with a mule and a pension that doesn't quite cover food. He looked at Milo steadily. But I still know things, and if you're smart, you'll learn them before winter comes. Why me? Why this project? Trigalis was quiet for a long moment. Because when I was young, a man taught me how to survive underground. He was Welsh, came from a mining family, knew things that would have taken me decades to learn on my own. He taught me because he saw I was trying to do real work, not just dig and haul like an animal. He taught me because he wanted what he knew to survive him. He met Milo's eyes. I'm dying, Harwood. The lungs are getting worse. I've got maybe 2 winters left, maybe 3. I'll say, and everything I know dies with me unless I pass it on. I'm a blacksmith. You're a blacksmith who's building his forge underground. That makes you the closest thing to a student I'm likely to find. He stood, wincing at the pain in his hip. Tomorrow we start on the pillar. The real pillar this time. With live stone and proper mortar and a foundation that won't shift when the ground freezes. By the end of August, the first pillar was complete. It rose 8 feet from the gorge floor to meet the natural ledge jutting from the east wall. Live stone throughout, tested and selected, stacked with clay mortar mixed to Trigalis' exact specifications. 3 parts clay to 1 part ash to 1 part sand. Wetted just enough to grip, but not so much that it would shrink when it dried. The pillar had taken 3 weeks. In that time, Milo had also finished stripping and stacking the remaining roof logs. 18 of them now, waiting for placement. Enough to cover the first 30 feet of the gorge, the section that would serve as living space and forge room both. Ruth's cough had not improved, but it had not worsened either. She insisted on working, and Milo let her because he had no choice. Perry had learned to test stone with the mine hammer, and he spent hours each day sorting the live rock from the rotten building piles that would eventually become the front wall. The mare died on the last day of August. She simply lay down in the traces one afternoon and did not get up again. Milo unhitched her, stroked her muzzle, and sat with her for an hour while her breathing slowed and finally stopped. Perry cried. Ruth did not, but she sat beside her father and held his hand while the light went out of the animal's eyes. They buried her on the ridge above the gorge, not far from where Clara lay. 3 graves now, looking out over the hills. 3 reminders of what Milo had lost. We can't haul logs without her, Ruth said that evening. I know. What do we do? I'll drag them myself. That's not possible. They're too heavy. You'll kill yourself. Milo looked at his daughter, 13 years old, already carrying more weight than any child should carry. Then I'll find another way. I always find another way. But he did not know what that way would be. And time was running out. September brought the first cold nights and the first real progress on the roof. Trigalis helped design a system of rollers, logs laid perpendicular to the gorge walls, over which the roof logs could be slid into place with ropes and leverage rather than lifted bodily. It was slow work, brutal work, requiring every ounce of strength Milo possessed and then demanding more. But it worked. By the 15th of September, the first 8 roof logs were in place, spanning from the west wall to the pillar. By the 20th, brush had been laid over them, a thick mat of pine branches woven tight. By the 25th, the first layer of clay was on, packed hard and smoothed by hand. The sod would come last, cut from the prairie above the gorge and laid in overlapping strips. But even without the sod, the covered section of the gorge was already different, darker, quieter. The wind that had whistled through the gap was now blocked by the brush and clay. The temperature inside, even on a cold night, stayed warmer than the air outside. "Feels like a mine," Trigalis observed, standing beneath the partial roof. "Feels like going underground." "Is that good?" "It's what it is. The question is whether you can make it something you want to live in." Reuben Pike rode out on the 1st of October. He had not visited the gorge since his warning in June. Now he stood at the rim, looking down at the construction below, and his expression was not what Milo had expected. There was no mockery in it, no triumph, just a kind of tired assessment, as if he were measuring the distance between what he had predicted and what he was seeing. "You're still at it," Pike said. "I'm still at it. And the old Cornishman is helping you." "Trigalis?" "Yes." Pike nodded slowly. "He's good. Best underground man I ever knew. Saved my life once. In a shaft collapse up near Deadwood. Knew exactly where to brace, exactly where the rock would hold. If anyone could teach you to live in stone, it's him." "Then why are you here?" Pike climbed down into the gorge, moving carefully along the slope. He walked the length of the construction, the drainage channel, the sump, the pillar, the partial roof, touching the walls, examining the work. When he reached the section where the first forge would be set, he crouched and studied the flue opening Milo had roughed out. "This is where the chimney goes?" "Yes." "Facing leeward?" "Trigalis said the prevailing wind comes from the northwest in winter, so the chimney faces southeast." Pike stood. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I still think you're going to die." "I know. But I'm less certain than I was." He met Milo's eyes. "You're building something real here, something that might work. I don't understand all of it, but I can see the work. I can see the thinking." "That sounds almost like a compliment." "It's not. I'm telling you that you've done better than I expected, and I still expect you to freeze to death before spring." He started back toward the slope. "But if you don't, if you somehow make it through, I'll be the first to admit I was wrong. I'll hold you to that." Pike paused at the rim. "Cyrus Dake is telling everyone in town that your children will be orphans by February. He's already got a family in mind to take them in. Good people from Rapid City. He's been writing letters." Milo felt his hands clench. "Well, he has no right." "He has every right. You owe him money. If you die, your estate, what's left of it, goes to pay the debt. Your children become wards of the county, and Dake happens to sit on the county welfare committee." Pike's expression was grim. "I'm telling you this because you need to know what you're fighting. It's not just the cold. It's not just the stone. It's the man who took everything from you, making sure that if the winter doesn't finish the job, he'll be there to pick up the pieces." He rode away without another word. The first forge fired on the 12th of October. Milo had built it from salvaged fire brick, cracked stove parts, and hand-shaped clay. The bellows was a rebuilt version of one he had owned for years, the leather patched and the boards tightened. The anvil sat on a stump hauled down from above the gorge, leveled and secured with stone wedges. He struck the first blow on a wagon tire that a freighter named Cole had left for repair. The ring of iron on iron echoed off the stone walls, sharper and clearer than it ever had in his old shop. The rock held the sound, amplified it, gave it back. Ruth and Perry watched from the front of the gorge, wrapped in blankets against the October chill. Trigalis sat on a stone ledge, his breathing labored, but his eyes bright. "Listen to that," he said. "The mountain's singing with you." Milo worked for 3 hours, shaping the tire, upsetting the rim where it had cracked, forge welding a patch over the weak spot. When he finished, the fire was banked, but the stone around the forge was warm to the touch, not hot, but perceptibly warmer than the air. "It works," Ruth said quietly. It works." Cole returned 2 days later to collect his tire. He paid with bacon, flour, and a promise to send other freighters Milo's way. By the end of October, word had spread. There was a blacksmith working in the gorge south of town, and he was good, and he charged fair prices. The work began to flow. Horseshoes for the stage company's remuda, hinges for a miner's sluice box, pick repairs for a prospector who had bent his blade on a granite outcrop, wagon tongue repair for a family heading to Rapid City. Each job brought payment, sometimes cash, usually barter. Charcoal from a burner who needed his tools sharpened, blankets from a widow who needed her kettle handle replaced, flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil. By November, the second forge was built. By mid-November, the third. The gorge was now fully roofed for the first 40 feet, with sod laid thick over the clay and brush. The front wall was closed except for the door and the windlock, a double-door arrangement Trigalis had designed that prevented direct drafts from entering the main space. The temperature inside on a 20-degree night stayed above 40. Milo checked it himself with a cheap mercury thermometer he had traded for 3 horseshoes. 41 degrees in the rear sleeping alcove. 52 on the main floor. The forge bay, when the fires were running, climbed into the 70s. Outside, frost covered the ground. Inside, water stayed liquid. Boots dried overnight. Breath did not fog. Reuben Pike had been wrong. The rock was not killing them. It was keeping them alive. December arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. With the temperature dropped to 5 degrees on the 3rd of the month, Milo banked all 3 forges overnight, using the minimum charcoal necessary to keep coals alive until morning. When he woke, the rear alcove was 37 degrees. The main floor was 44. The forge bay, with the coals glowing faintly, was 61. He checked the walls. The inner surface of the granite, where it faced the heated space, was warm to the touch. Not warm like a stove, subtle, faint, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but present. The stone was holding heat. Trigalis had explained the physics in simple terms. Dense material absorbs energy slowly and releases it slowly. The rock walls, heated day after day by the forges, had absorbed that heat into their mass. Now they were giving it back at night, when the fires burned low. It was not enough to keep the space warm on its own. The forges still had to run, but the forges no longer had to run at full intensity. The stone was helping. "It's like having an extra stove," Ruth said, pressing her palm against the wall. "A stove you don't have to feed." "Not quite. More like a blanket. It doesn't make heat. It just holds on to what's already there. Still, it's something." It was more than something. It was the difference between survival and disaster. A normal house lost heat through every surface, walls, roof, floor, windows. The heat from the stove poured out into the winter air as fast as it was generated, requiring constant fuel to maintain even basic comfort. But the gorge lost heat through only one surface, the sod roof. The walls were already at earth temperature. The floor was solid rock. The only escape route for warmth was upward, and the thick mat of brush, clay, and sod slowed that escape to a crawl. The math that Reuben Pike had calculated, 8 cords of wood for a normal house did not apply here. Milo burned perhaps a quarter of that, mostly in charcoal, and the space stayed warmer than any frame structure in the county. But December was not the test. December was rehearsal. January was execution. The 12th of January arrived like a breaking wave. Milo woke that morning to stillness. The air had that peculiar density that comes before a storm, heavy, waiting, charged. He had seen it before, in gentler forms. This was different. This felt like something gathering strength. By noon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By 3 o'clock, the wind had risen from nothing to a sustained howl that stripped snow from the hills and sent it screaming horizontally through the air. By sunset, though sunset was impossible to see through the white chaos, the thermometer outside the front windlock read 12 below zero. And it was still falling. Milo sealed the windlock, banking all 3 forges to maintain heat without consuming fuel too quickly. Ruth wrapped Perry in every blanket they owned and put him in the rear alcove where the temperature held steadiest. Trigalis arrived just before the visibility dropped to nothing, his mule abandoned in someone's barn in town, his face raw from the cold. "It's a bad one," he said, his breath whistling in his chest. "The worst I've seen since '83. "How long?" "No way to know. Could be a day, could be a week. The old-timers talk about storms that lasted a month." The first night passed in a blur of wind and darkness. Milo fed the forges in shifts, keeping the heat constant, checking the temperature in the alcove every few hours. Perry slept fitfully. Ruth sat up with her father, watching the door as if expecting the storm to break through at any moment. By morning, the wind had not slowed. The thermometer outside read 22 below. The drifts against the front wall had risen to 4 feet. And then the first refugees arrived. Ada Leland was the school teacher, a thin, practical woman in her early 30s who had come to Custer City from Ohio 3 years prior. She arrived at the Gorge with 6 children who could not get home, leading them through the drifts like a shepherd guiding lambs through wolves. The schoolhouse stove cracked, she said, her voice raw from shouting over the wind. "The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. I couldn't send them home. The visibility is nothing. I couldn't keep them there. We would have frozen before dark." Milo pulled them in through the windlock, one by one. Children of miners, ranchers, storekeepers, ages 6 to 12, terrified and half-frozen. Ruth wrapped them in blankets. Perry made room in the rear alcove. Trigalis fed the forges. "How did you know to come here?" Milo asked. Ada met his eyes. "Because you're the only one in this county who's been talking sense about winter since August. Everyone else built board walls and bought parlor stoves. You built into rock and kept forges running." She paused. "I listened, even when they were laughing at you." More arrived throughout the day. Reuben Pike's married daughter, Eleanor, with her 2 children and her husband's mother, a woman of 70 who could barely walk through the drifts. Their parlor stove had warped in the cold, cracking along the firebox, rendering it useless. The house had dropped to freezing within hours. A family named Sutton, father, mother, 3 children, whose cabin was a mile north of town. They had run out of dry wood by the second day and were burning furniture when their neighbor convinced them to try for the gorge. A prospector named Harlan, alone, who had been caught in the storm while crossing the ridge and had followed the light from the forge chimney down to the gorge entrance. By the 3rd night, the 43 people were crowded into the space Milo had built for 3. The 4th night was the worst. The temperature outside dropped to 31 below zero. The wind shifted from northwest to north, directly into the chimney facing, and for 2 terrifying hours, smoke began pooling in the main chamber instead of rising through the flue. Milo and Trigalis climbed out through the windlock into the chaos of the storm. The snow was so thick that Milo could not see his own hand at arm's length. The cold was a physical force, pressing against his skin, stealing the heat from his body faster than his heart could replace it. They fought their way to the chimney, a stone column rising 4 feet above the sod roof, and found the cap clogged with ice. Trigalis knocked the ice clear with his hammer, while Milo braced against the wind. Hurried then they widened the low air intake on the opposite side of the roof, forcing more cold air into the system to restore the draft. By the time they climbed back inside, both men were shaking uncontrollably, their fingers white and nearly useless. But the smoke was rising again. The air was clearing. The forges still burned. Then Eleanor's youngest stopped breathing. The boy was 4 years old. He had been coughing since they arrived, and the cough had worsened through the night. Now he lay limp in his mother's arms, his lips blue, his chest still. Ruth acted before anyone else could move. She tilted the boy's head back, clearing his airway the way she had seen her mother do once, years ago, for a neighbor's child who had choked on an apple. She put her mouth over his and breathed, once, twice, 3 times. She pressed on his chest, eurythmically counting under her breath. 15 seconds passed, 30. The room was silent except for the wind and the crackle of the forges. Then the boy coughed, drew breath, cried. Eleanor collapsed against the wall, sobbing. The other children watched with wide eyes. Perry held his sister's hand and would not let go. "Where did you learn that?" Milo asked afterward, when the boy was breathing steadily and wrapped in blankets by the warmest forge. "I don't know," Ruth said. "I just remembered. Mama did it once. I was little." She had saved a life, 13 years old, exhausted, still coughing from whatever illness had been haunting her for months, and she had saved a life. Milo looked at his daughter and saw her mother looking back at him. Clara's eyes, Clara's steadiness, Clara's refusal to stop trying when trying was all that was left. "You're going to be all right," he said quietly. "I know," Ruth said. "We all are." The crisis peaked on the 6th day. The temperature outside had held at 25 below for 48 hours. The drifts were over 6 feet in places, burying the front wall entirely. The only way in or out was through a tunnel Milo had cut each morning, which filled in again by afternoon. Food was running low. 43 people consumed resources at a rate Milo had never planned for. He rationed flour, rationed salt pork, rationed the dried beans that were the backbone of every meal. Children went hungry, adults went hungrier, and Trigalis collapsed. His lungs, worn out from decades of mining dust, finally failed under the strain of the cold and the work and the smoke that no ventilation system could entirely eliminate. He fell beside the second forge and did not get up. Milo carried him to the rear alcove and covered him with blankets. Trigalis's breathing was shallow, wet, and there was blood on his lips. "The draft," Trigalis whispered. "Keep watching the draft. If the wind shifts again—" "I know. You taught me." "The stone. Trust the stone. It's holding more heat than you think." "Don't!" He coughed, and more blood came up. "Don't let the forges go out, even for an hour. The mass will cool and you'll lose everything." "I won't let them go out." Trigalis closed his eyes. For a moment, Milo thought he was gone. Then the old man spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You're going to make it. I didn't believe it when I first saw you, but you are. You're going to make it. So are you." "No." Trigalis's hand found Milo's and gripped it weakly. "But that's all right. Someone has to stay in the mountain. That's what we always said in Cornwall. Someone has to stay, so the ones who leave can remember." He slept. Milo stayed with him for an hour, then returned to the forges. The seventh day the wind eased. It did not stop. It would not stop for another week, but the killing intensity faded. The temperature climbed from 25 below to 15 below. The drifts stopped growing. A weak sun appeared through the clouds, painting the snow a pale gold. Milo cut the tunnel through the drift and climbed out onto the surface. The world was transformed. White in every direction, smooth and unbroken, erasing all landmarks. Although the town was invisible, the hills were invisible. Only the chimney of the gorge rose above the snow, a dark column trailing smoke into the frozen air. He stood there for a long time, breathing cold air that no longer felt like a weapon. They had made it. Not all of them. Trigalis was still unconscious in the alcove, his breathing worse by the hour, but most of them. 43 people had entered the gorge as refugees, and 43 would leave when the roads cleared. When he climbed back down, Reuben Pike was waiting for him. Pike had arrived 3 days into the storm, seeking shelter like everyone else. He had worked beside Milo, feeding forges, cutting firewood, helping ration food. He had not complained, had not offered opinions, had not said a word about what he had predicted back in June. Now he stood by the east wall, was his hand pressed against the stone. "It's warm," he said. "I know." "The rock, it's actually warm." He looked at Milo with an expression of bewilderment. "How is that possible? It's been 30 below for a week. Everything outside is frozen solid, and the rock is warm." "Because we've been heating it since October. The stone absorbed it. Now it's giving it back." "That doesn't—" Pike stopped, shook his head. "I told you the rock would kill you. I said your children would die in it before January was out. You did. I was wrong." The words came out slowly, as if each one cost him something. "I've been freighting these hills for 15 years. I've seen men die every way a man can die out here. I thought I knew what worked and what didn't. I thought—" He paused. "I thought you were a fool, building something that couldn't possibly work. So did everyone. But it works. This—" He gestured at the chamber, at the forges, at the people huddled in blankets throughout the space. "This works. Not just survives. Works. Better than any house in the county right now." Milo thought of Trigalis, unconscious in the alcove, his lungs failing, his life running out. He thought of Ruth, who had saved a child's life with knowledge she did not know she possessed. He thought of Clara, buried on the ridge, who would never see what her husband and children had built. "It works," Milo said quietly. "But it costs more than I wanted to pay." Pike nodded. He did not ask what Milo meant. He understood that some prices are tallied in things other than money. They stood in silence while the forges burned, and the stone held its warmth, and the worst winter in memory slowly, finally, began to release its grip on the Black Hills. The storm released its grip on the Black Hills over the following week. Roads emerged from the drifts. Supply wagons resumed their routes. The 43 people who had sheltered in Milo's Gorge returned to their homes, their farms, their ordinary lives, carrying with them a story that would reshape the county's understanding of what was possible. Trigalis died on the morning of January 23rd, 11 days after the storm began. He passed quietly in the rear alcove with Milo beside him. His breathing had grown shallower each day, the blood more frequent, the periods of consciousness shorter. Near the end, he woke once and gripped Milo's hand with surprising strength. "The notebook," he said. "In my coat. Take it." Milo found it that afternoon, a small leather-bound book, grease-stained and worn, filled with cramped handwriting and faded ink. Diagrams of arch spans, ratios for flue construction, notes on mortar composition, drawings of ventilation systems he had built in mines across 3 continents, a lifetime of underground knowledge compressed into 87 pages. He buried Trigalis on the ridge beside Clara, where the morning sun hit first and the view stretched across the hills. Perry helped dig the grave. Ruth stood watch while Milo spoke words he did not remember afterward, something about stone and survival and the things that outlast us. When it was done, Milo stood alone at the grave for a long time. 3 mounds now. Your 3 people who had shaped his life. Clara, who had given him children. The mayor, who had given him labor. Trigalis, who had given him knowledge. The wind moved across the ridge, carrying the smell of pine and cold earth. Milo opened the notebook to a random page and found a passage in Trigalis' careful handwriting. The mountain does not care if you live or die, but it will tell you the truth if you know how to listen. Strike the rock, hear the answer, trust what rings true. He closed the notebook and put it in his coat. Then he went back down to the gorge, where the forges were waiting, and the work was not done. The validation began 3 days after the burial. Owen Blevins arrived first, riding a borrowed horse through the half-cleared roads. He tied the animal outside the gorge and climbed down into the chamber without speaking, his eyes moving across the space, the walls, the roof, the forges, the drainage channel, the sod-covered ceiling that had held through a week of the worst weather anyone could remember. "I came to see it," he finally said, "what they're all talking about." And Blevins walked to the east wall and pressed his palm against the stone. He held it there for a long moment, feeling the warmth that still radiated from the granite, even though the forges had been banked for hours. "It shouldn't work," he said. "Everything I know about construction says it shouldn't work. 18-foot spans, sod roofing over a ravine, no proper foundation. And yet 43 people survived in here when they would have frozen anywhere else." He turned to face Milo. "I called you a fool. I said the roof would collapse and the drainage would fail and the smoke would kill your children. I was wrong about all of it." "You weren't entirely wrong. The drainage almost failed the first week. The roof needed supports I hadn't planned for. The smoke did pool until Trigalis taught me how to fix the draft." "But you fixed it. That's the point." Blevins looked around the chamber again. "I've built houses for 9 years. Frame construction, proper foundations, milled lumber and glass windows, and none of them would have done what this place did last week. None of them would have held 43 people alive through 30 below. They're built for normal winters." "Oh, this wasn't a normal winter." "No, it wasn't." Blevins was quiet for a moment. "I want to learn. Whatever you did here, the rock testing, the drainage, the heat storage, the ventilation, I want to understand it. Not to copy it exactly, but to take pieces of it. Apply them to what I already know." "Why?" "Because next time a storm like that comes, and it will come, people are going to die in the houses I built, unless I learn how to build better ones." He met Milo's eyes. "Will you teach me?" Milo thought of Trigalis, who had taught him because he wanted his knowledge to survive. He thought of the notebook in his coat, filled with lessons meant to be passed on. "Yes," he said, "I'll teach you." The Sutton family came next. They had been among the refugees, father, mother, and 3 children who had fled their cabin when the firewood ran out. Now they returned, not seeking shelter, but seeking advice. Their cabin had survived the storm, but barely. The walls had held, but the gaps between the logs had let in cold that the small stove could not overcome. The floor, laid directly on frozen ground, had turned to ice by the 3rd night. The windows, single-paned glass in warped frames, had radiated cold into the room like open doors. "We almost died," Marcus Sutton said. He was a rancher, a practical man with calloused hands and a face weathered by wind. If your place hadn't been here, we would have died. Our children would have died. I'm glad you made it. We want to rebuild. Not the whole cabin, we can't afford that. But the parts that failed, the parts that almost killed us. He looked around the gorge. I don't expect you to teach us everything you know, but if there's anything at all that we could do differently, we need to hear it. Milo spent 2 hours with them, explaining the principles Trigalis had taught him. Not the full underground construction that required a specific site and specific skills, but the pieces that could apply anywhere. Banking earth against exterior walls to reduce heat loss, building windlocks instead of single doors, insulating floors with straw and clay, positioning stoves against interior walls rather than exterior ones, sealing gaps with a mixture of clay, ash, and animal hair. It's not complicated, Milo said. It's just thinking about where the heat goes and putting barriers in its way. Every surface that touches cold air is a surface that steals warmth. Reduce those surfaces, or insulate them, and the same stove will heat the same room twice as well. Sarah Sutton, who had said little throughout, finally spoke. The stone walls. They hold heat, you said. Can we do that without building into a gorge? A masonry wall will hold some heat. Not as much as bedrock, but some. A thick chimney, especially. Build it in the center of the house. Let it absorb warmth all day, and it will radiate through the night even after the fire dies down. We have stone. The whole ridgeline is granite. Then use it. Cut it or stack it dry, but use it. A stone chimney in the center of your cabin will hold more heat than the board walls on every side. They left with notes Sarah had made on scraps of paper, detailed drawings of windlocks and banked walls and chimney placement. 2 weeks later, Marcus Sutton returned to show Milo what they had done. A new windlock on the front door, earth banked 3 feet high around the north and west walls, and the beginning of a central stone chimney that would replace the warped iron stove. It's already warmer, he said. 10 degrees warmer on the coldest nights, with the same amount of wood. I didn't believe it would make that much difference. Physics doesn't care what you believe, it just works. Word spread. Throughout February, visitors came to the gorge, not refugees now, but students. Farmers wanting to know how to site root cellars that would not flood. Miners curious about the ventilation system that had kept the air breathable even with 3 forges running. Carpenters asking about the roof construction, the span supports, was the way the sod had held under the weight of the snow. Ada Leland came too. She had returned to teaching as soon as the schoolhouse stove was replaced, but she visited the gorge in the evenings, bringing books she thought might be useful, volumes on geology, on construction, on the physics of heat transfer. Most of them were too technical for Milo's purposes, written for educated engineers rather than practical builders. But he read them anyway, looking for the principles beneath the jargon, the ideas he could translate into methods that ordinary people could use. You're building something more than a workshop, Ada said one evening, watching him sketch a diagram for a rancher who wanted to understand drainage. You're building a school. I'm just showing people what I learned. That's what a school is. Someone who knows something. You're teaching it to someone who doesn't. She paused. You could do more. Formal lessons, written guides, something people could take away and refer to later. I'm not a teacher. Neither was I before I started teaching. She smiled. You're already doing it. You're just not calling it by the right name. Cyrus Dake did not come to the gorge. He stayed in town, in his bank, behind his ledgers, and watched as the man he had ruined became something he had never anticipated. The whispers reached him, of course. They could not help but reach him. Harwood's cave had kept 43 people alive. Harwood's methods were spreading through the county. Harwood's name was spoken with respect now, not pity. Dake responded the only way he knew how, with pressure. He called in debts from families who had sheltered in the gorge, these suggesting that gratitude to Harwood was misplaced loyalty. He reminded storekeepers that credit was a privilege, not a right, and that those who associated too openly with certain parties might find their own credit reconsidered. He spoke, at every opportunity, of the original failure, the foreclosed ranch, the lost cattle, the $2,400 note that had never been repaid. Harwood is still a debtor, he told anyone who would listen. He still owes this bank. Whatever he's built in that gorge, it doesn't change what he owes. And a man who doesn't pay his debts is not a man to be trusted with anything else. The pressure worked on some. A few farmers who had planned to visit the gorge for advice stayed away, not wanting to be associated with someone Dake had marked. A storekeeper who had been willing to extend credit quietly withdrew the offer. The subtle machinery of small-town finance, which Dake controlled, began to turn against Milo once again. But something had changed since the storm. Milo noticed it first in the way people looked at him, not with pity or dismissal, but with a kind of wary respect. They had seen what he had built. They had lived through what his innovation could do. And while Dake's money carried weight, survival carried more. Eleanor Pike, Reuben's daughter, was the first to say it publicly. She had come to the gorge to thank Milo for sheltering her family, and she had stayed to ask questions about windlocks and earth banking. When she finished, she stood at the entrance and looked back at the chamber that had kept her children alive. "My father-in-law owes Dake money," she said. "Most of this county owes Dake money. He uses it like a whip to make people do what he wants. But you don't owe him anything anymore. You paid him back." "I still owe him $2,400. "No, you don't." She met his eyes. "When 43 people would have died and you kept them alive, you paid a debt that money can't measure. Whatever's in his ledger, it's nothing compared to what this place is worth. And everyone who sheltered here knows it." The spring thaw brought new challenges. The snow began melting in March, sending water down every slope and through every channel. The gorge, which had been dry through the winter, suddenly faced the test Trigalis had warned about. Would the drainage system handle spring runoff? Milo woke on the 3rd of March to the sound of water. Not the gentle trickle he had heard during summer rains, but a steady rush, like a creek finding a new bed. He pulled on his boots and ran to the main chamber, expecting the worst. The water was running through the channel exactly as designed, fast and heavy, but contained, flowing toward the sump and then out through the subsurface drain. The floor was damp in places where the channel overflowed, but not flooded. The sump was full, but emptying steadily. The system was working. Then the diversion ditch clogged. The ditch Trigalis had made him cut above the gorge, the one that directed surface water away from the entrance, had filled with debris over the winter. Branches, dead leaves, chunks of ice still not melted. The water, finding the ditch blocked, went around it, so straight toward the front wall and the entrance below. Milo scrambled up the slope with a shovel, his boots slipping on the wet rock. The water was already pouring over the threshold of the windlock, flooding into the chamber. Ruth shouted from below. Perry was moving charcoal sacks to higher ground. He dug furiously, clearing the debris, widening the ditch where ice had narrowed it. The water resisted, then gave way, then finally turned and flowed along the path he had restored for it. Within an hour, the flood had stopped. The entrance was draining. The chamber was saved. But the lesson was clear. Trigalis had told him water discipline means constant attention, ditch first, sump second, threshold last, and maintenance forever. He reinforced the diversion ditch that afternoon, lining it with flat stones to prevent future clogging. He raised the threshold of the windlock by 3 inches, creating a lip that would stop minor overflow from entering. He checked every inch of the drainage system, from the channel to the sump to the outflow, making repairs where winter had caused settling or cracking. "You're doing his work now," Ruth said, watching him adjust the stone lining of the channel. "The old man's work." "Trigalis." "Yes, him." She paused. "He taught you more than I realized. He taught me everything that matters. Do you miss him?" Milo set down the stone he was holding. "Every day, every time I strike a wall to test the rock, every time I check the draft on the chimneys, every time I see something I don't know how to fix and reach for the notebook he left me." He looked at his daughter. "He gave me 3 months of his life, and he gave me everything he had learned in 60 years. I don't think I'll ever stop missing him." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He would be proud of what you're doing, teaching people, sharing what he taught you." "I hope so. I know so." She smiled just slightly. "Because I'm proud of you, and I learned how to be proud from him." The secondary crisis came in April. A mining outfit to the north, a small operation called the Garner Claim, had been working a promising vein through the winter. When the thaw came, their main shaft flooded. The pumps they had rigged could not keep up with the water, and within 3 days the lower levels were submerged. The equipment they had left below, drills, ore carts, hundreds of dollars worth of iron and steel, was lost beneath 10 feet of muddy water. Where Thomas Garner rode to the gorge on the 4th day. "I heard you know something about water underground," he said. His face was gray with exhaustion and something that looked like despair. "I heard you built this place with drainage that works. I need help." Milo looked at him, a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered and worn down by the work of pulling silver from stone. "What kind of help?" "I don't know. Anything. The water keeps rising. We've tried pumping. We've tried bailing. We've tried everything we can think of. Nothing works. And if I can't get to that equipment, I'm finished. The whole claim is finished." "Show me." They rode north together, 2 hours through the hills to a scarred hillside where the Garner Claim clung to the slope. The main shaft descended at an angle, following the vein into the earth. At the entrance, whose water was seeping out, a slow but steady flow that indicated far worse below. Milo descended the first 50 feet until the water blocked further progress. He struck the walls as Trigalis had taught him, listening to the sound. Dead rock. Fractured, unstable, full of cracks that acted as channels for groundwater. The vein the miners had been following cut through a zone that was essentially porous, letting in water from all directions. "You can't pump it out," Milo said when he climbed back up. "Not permanently. The rock around your shaft is like a sponge. Every gallon you remove, another gallon seeps in." "Then what? Abandon everything?" "No." Milo thought of Trigalis' notebook, of the pages on water management in mines. "You redirect it. Find where the water is coming from, the main source, not the seepage, and give it somewhere else to go. A drainage adit, cut below the level of your shaft, angled to carry the water out by gravity. A drainage adit. A tunnel, horizontal or nearly so, cut into the hillside below your flooded levels. If you site it right, the water will drain downhill through the adit instead of pooling in your shaft. The pumps become maintenance, not rescue." Garner stared at him. "Do you know how to cut something like that?" "I know the principles. Trigalis, the man who taught me, he designed drainage systems in mines all over the hills. He left notes, drawings. I've read them, but I've never done it myself." "Will you try?" Milo thought of the forges waiting in the gorge. The repairs still owed to a dozen customers. The lessons he had promised to teach Owen Blevins and the Sutton family. Ruth's cough, which had improved but not entirely faded. "I'll try," he said. "But I can't promise it will work, and I can't do it alone. You'll need to dig. Your men will need to dig. I'll tell you where and how, but the labor is yours." Done. The work took 3 weeks. Milo spent the first week surveying, using techniques he had learned from Trigalis' notebook, measuring slopes, testing rock, tracing the likely paths that water took through the fractured stone. He found the main source, an underground stream that had been diverted by the mining work, forced into channels it had never occupied before. The stream wanted to flow downhill to the east. The shaft stood in its way. The solution was elegant in principle and brutal in execution. Cut a tunnel and at it from a point on the hillside below the flooded levels, angling upward until it intersected the water table. Once connected, the water would drain downhill through the adit, leaving the shaft to dry out. "It's the same principle as my gorge," Milo explained to Garner and his crew. "Water follows gravity. Give it a path that goes where you want, and it will take that path instead of the one that causes problems." The digging was hard. The rock was fractured but not soft, requiring picks and chisels and occasional blasting. Milo supervised every foot, checking the angle, testing the walls, watching for signs that they had reached the water table. On the 15th day, they broke through into saturated rock, and water began trickling out of the adit. By the 17th day, the trickle had become a stream. By the 20th, the main shaft was draining faster than it was filling. On the 21st day, Garner's men descended to the lower levels and found their equipment still intact, waiting to be salvaged. "How much do I owe you?" Garner asked when it was done. Milo thought about it. The work had cost him 3 weeks. 3 weeks when he could have been running the forges, earning his own keep, teaching others. But the work had also proven something. Trigalis' knowledge was not just for one gorge in one location. It could travel. It could solve problems far beyond anything Milo had originally imagined. "Nothing," he said. "Tell people what we did, how we did it. If someone else has a flooded mine, send them to me. That's payment enough." Word of the Garner drainage spread faster than word of the gorge had. Miners talked. Freighters carried the story. By June, Milo was receiving inquiries from claims throughout the southern hills, not all of them floods, but all of them problems with water, rock, ventilation, heat, a stamp mill with chimneys that backdrafted in certain winds, a prospect tunnel that kept collapsing at the same depth, a root cellar that flooded every spring despite 2 years of attempted fixes. He could not solve all of them. Some problems were beyond his knowledge, beyond Trigalis' notebook, beyond anything he had learned in 6 months of desperate construction. But he could solve more than he expected, and every solution added to his reputation, his understanding, and the web of gratitude that now spread across the county. Cyrus Dake felt the shift. The banker had spent 6 months trying to maintain the fiction that Milo Harwood was a failure, a debtor, a man whose brief moment of accidental usefulness did not change his fundamental character. But the fiction was becoming harder to sustain. Milo was solving problems that Dake's money could not solve. Milo was teaching skills that Dake's influence could not provide. Milo was becoming slowly but undeniably indispensable to a community that had once been ready to watch him freeze. In July, Dake made his move. He filed papers with the county clerk, claiming that the Gorge, the land on which Milo had built his forge, his shelter, his school, was properly part of the original foreclosed property. The claim was dubious at best. The Gorge lay a half-mile from the nearest boundary of the old ranch, on land that had never been surveyed as part of the holding. But Dake had lawyers, and Dake had influence. And Dake had the patience of a man who had built his fortune one careful manipulation at a time. "He's trying to take the Gorge," Ruth said when she heard. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. After everything, he's trying to take it. I know. Can he? The claim is weak. The land was never part of the original deed, but he can tie it up in courts for years if he wants to. He can make it so expensive to fight that I have no choice but to give in. What do we do? Milo looked at his daughter, 15 now, taller than she had been a year ago, stronger than she had any right to be after everything she had survived. We fight, he said. Not the way he fights, with lawyers and papers and money. We fight with witnesses. The hearing was held on the 12th of August in the county courthouse in Custer City. Dake arrived with 2 lawyers and a stack of documents, surveys, deeds, correspondence going back to the original claim. He looked confident, the way he always looked, as if the outcome were already decided and this proceeding was merely a formality. Milo arrived with 43 people. They filled the courtroom: farmers, miners, ranchers, storekeepers, the families who had sheltered in the gorge during the January storm. They stood along the walls when the seats ran out. They spilled into the hallway. They came because Ada Leland had spread the word, because Eleanor Pike had organized transportation, because Owen Blevins had closed his carpentry shop for the day and told every customer where they should be instead. The judge, a man named Harris who had presided over frontier disputes for 15 years, he looked at the crowd with unconcealed surprise. This is a property hearing, he said, not a trial. These are witnesses, Milo replied. They're here to testify to the nature of the property in question. Dake's lead lawyer objected. The question is simple. Does the land on which Mr. Harwood built his structure fall within the boundaries of the foreclosed ranch? Witnesses have nothing to add to a surveyor's measurements. The question, Milo said, is whether the land was ever part of the original deed. The land was never surveyed as part of my ranch because I never claimed it as part of my ranch. I built there after the foreclosure on public land with my own hands and my own tools. The structure I built from scratch. The materials I used were salvage, trade, going and the rock of the gorge itself, which belonged to no one. Your Honor. Furthermore, Milo continued, I have 43 witnesses who can testify that they sheltered in that structure during the January storm. They saw the work I had done. They know when it was done, months after the foreclosure. They know I owned nothing when I started. Mr. Dake's own claim papers describe the property he seized: a ranch house, corrals, a barn. None of those structures exist at the gorge. None of them ever existed there. What exists is something I created from nothing on land that was no one's. The judge turned to Dake. Is this accurate? Was the gorge surveyed as part of the original ranch? Dake's lawyer hesitated. We believe the natural extension of the property. Was it surveyed or wasn't it? A longer hesitation. It was not specifically surveyed, no, but the intent of the original deed. Intent is for philosophers. Judge Harris looked at the stack of documents Dake had brought. These papers describe a specific property with specific boundaries. If the gorge falls outside those boundaries, it doesn't belong to the foreclosed estate. It belongs to whoever built on it first. Your Honor, the debt is a separate matter. Mr. Harwood may owe Mr. Dake money. That's between them and whatever arrangements they make. But this court deals in property, and property means boundaries. If the land wasn't part of the original deed, Mr. Dake has no more claim to it than I do. He looked at Milo. You said you built with your own hands after the foreclosure. I did, beginning in June of '87. I have witnesses, Milo gestured at the crowd, who saw the work in progress throughout the summer and fall. And the materials? Salvage from abandoned claims, stone from the gorge itself. Iron from my own tools, which were not part of the foreclosed property. Charcoal I burned from slash pine on public land. Everything I used, I can account for. Judge Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Dake. Mr. Dake, do you have a surveyor's report that places the gorge within your property boundaries? Dake's face was tight. We have not yet completed a formal survey, but then we're done here. Harris picked up his gavel. The property claim is denied for lack of evidence. Mr. Harwood retains possession of the structure he built. If Mr. Dake wishes to pursue the underlying debt through other channels, he may do so. But the gorge is not part of this bank's holdings, and it never was. The gavel came down. The crowd erupted, and Cyrus Dake, for the first time in Milo's memory, looked at him with something other than contempt. It looked just for a moment like fear. Eleanor Pike's husband, Thomas, found Milo outside the courthouse after the hearing. Thomas was a quiet man, a freighter who had worked the Cheyenne Road for a decade before marrying Reuben's daughter and settling into ranching. He had sheltered in the gorge during the storm, had seen what Milo's innovation could do, and had said little about it afterward. Now he stood in front of Milo with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound discomfort on his weathered face. I owe you an apology, he said. For what? For what I said about you before. When you were building the gorge, I was one of the ones laughing, one of the ones calling it a stone coffin. He looked at the ground. My children would have died in that storm if you hadn't been there. My mother would have died, and I was one of the ones who laughed. A lot of people laughed. That doesn't make it right. Thomas looked up. What can I do? To make it right? Milo thought about it. The man's shame was genuine, his regret real, but shame and regret were not useful currencies. Can you haul stone? What? I need stone for a project. A family north of here wants a storm vestibule added to their cabin, proper masonry work. I can design it and supervise the work, but I need material hauled. Can you help with that? Thomas stared at him. You want me to haul stone for a family I've never met? We're to make up for laughing at you? I want you to help build something that will keep people alive. That's what makes it right, not apologizing, building. After a long moment, Thomas nodded. When do we start? Tomorrow. Bring your wagon. The summer ended with the gorge transformed. What had been a desperate survival shelter was now a working forge, a teaching space, and a center for the kind of practical knowledge that no school in the territory could provide. Milo had expanded the covered area by another 20 feet, adding a warm room for visitors and a small alcove where Ruth kept the books and handled the growing correspondence from people seeking advice. Owen Blevins had become something like a partner, so visiting several times a week to discuss construction problems and share what he had learned from applying Milo's methods to his own work. The Sutton cabin was now the warmest structure for miles, a testament to what could be done with stone chimneys and earth banking and windlocks. A dozen other families had made smaller improvements, and all of them reported the same result: warmer spaces, less fuel, greater comfort. Ada Leland came most evenings now. She helped Ruth organize the notes and drawings that accumulated from each teaching session. She helped Milo articulate principles that he understood intuitively but struggled to explain, and she stayed longer each time until staying seemed more natural than leaving. You've built something remarkable, she said one evening as they sat by the forge watching the coals settle. Not just the structure, something larger. A way of thinking about problems that other people are starting to adopt? Trigalis built it. I'm just carrying it forward. You're doing more than carrying it forward. You're making it accessible. He knew how to work underground. You're teaching people how to apply those principles above ground in their own homes with materials they can afford. She paused. That's a different kind of genius. Milo looked at her, intelligent, practical, patient. She had organized the school children during the storm. She had kept the records that proved when the gorge was built. She had helped spread the word that brought 43 witnesses to the courthouse. He realized with a clarity that surprised him that she had become indispensable. Stay, he said. I always stay. You know that. No. Stay. Not for the evening. Stay here. With us. Ada was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the September wind moved through the hills, carrying the first hints of another winter coming. Yes, she said finally. I think I will. The second winter came gentler than the first. The storms arrived in December, as they always did, but they were ordinary storms, cold and fierce, but not killing, not the kind that trapped people in their homes for weeks and tested the limits of what shelter could do. Milo kept the forges running, kept the chamber warm, and found himself with something he had not expected: time. He used it to teach. By January, 3 families had sent their eldest sons to learn blacksmithing. Not the desperate improvised work Milo had done the year before, but proper craft, the kind of training that took years and produced journeymen who could eventually run their own shops. The boys lived in the chamber during the coldest months, sleeping in the rear alcove, working the forges by day, learning to read heat colors and judge carbon content and shape metal into useful things. Ruth ran the administrative side now. At 15, she had become the keeper of records, the scheduler of appointments, the first point of contact for anyone seeking Milo's help. She had inherited her mother's organizational mind and her father's stubbornness, and she applied both to the growing operation with a precision that Milo could never have managed alone. Perry, at 10, was learning the bellows. He was too young for the heavy work, but he understood rhythm and timing. He understood that a forge needed air the way a fire needed fuel. He stood at the bellows for hours, pumping steadily, watching his father work, absorbing lessons through observation that would take years to fully understand. Ada had moved into the chamber in October. There had been no ceremony, no formal announcement. She had simply stopped leaving, and eventually her belongings migrated from her rented room in town to the alcove beside the sleeping quarters. They were married in November, quietly, with Reuben Pike and Owen Blevins as witnesses. The county clerk recorded the union in the same book where, 18 months earlier, he had recorded the foreclosure that had cost Milo everything. A strange symmetry, Ada observed when Milo told her. The clerk didn't seem to notice. Clerks rarely do. They record facts, not to meanings. She paused. But we notice. And that's what matters. The operation at full scale looked nothing like what Milo had imagined when he first measured the gorge with a length of rope. 3 forges ran daily now, each with its own specialty. The first handled horseshoes and wagon work, the bread-and-butter repairs that kept freighters moving and ranchers working. The second handled tool manufacture, picks, shovels, hinges, chains, the 1,000 small items that frontier life required. The third handled the heavy work, wagon tire resets, structural iron, the occasional piece of machinery repair that required both strength and precision. The apprentices rotated through all 3, learning each type of work before specializing. The oldest, a young man named Samuel, who had arrived barely knowing which end of a hammer to hold, Bouin was now capable of running the first forge independently. The middle one, Thomas Sutton's nephew, showed promise with the precision work. The youngest was still learning to pump bellows without tiring, but he would grow into the trade as Perry was growing into it. Beyond the forge work, the teaching had expanded into something Milo had never anticipated. He held sessions twice a week now, one on construction principles, one on water management. Farmers attended the construction sessions, learning about earth banking and windlocks and thermal mass. Miners attended the water sessions, learning about drainage systems and ventilation, and the principles Trigalis had developed over 30 years of underground work. Ada took notes at every session, organizing them into what she called practical guides, simple documents that distilled complex principles into steps ordinary people could follow. "You're writing a book," Milo said one evening, looking over her shoulder at the stack of papers she had accumulated. "I'm writing several books, or at least the beginnings of them." She held up a sheaf of pages. "This one is about heating, how to keep a structure warm with minimal fuel, the physics of heat retention, the materials that work best, the common mistakes people make." She held up another. "This one is about water, drainage, flooding, runoff control, how to site a building to avoid problems, how to fix problems that already exist." Who would read them? Everyone who comes to your sessions. Everyone who hears about what you've done here and wants to learn but can't make the journey. Everyone who inherits a farm or a mine or a homestead and needs to understand how to survive in it. She set the papers down. Knowledge doesn't help anyone if it stays in one place. It has to travel. Cyrus Dake's final reckoning came in March. The banker had been quiet since the courthouse defeat, but quiet was not the same as defeated. He had continued his quiet pressure campaign, a word here, a denied credit there, a subtle suggestion that association with Harwood remained inadvisable. But the pressure was losing force. Every family that visited the Gorge and came away with useful knowledge was a family less susceptible to Dake's influence. But every problem Milo solved was another crack in the wall of financial dependency that Dake had built around the county. Then his wife spoke at the church social. Margaret Dake was a quiet woman, married to Cyrus for 23 years, mother of 3 grown children, grandmother of 2. She had never publicly contradicted her husband, never offered opinions on business matters, never done anything to suggest she was anything other than the silent partner a frontier banker expected. But she had also sheltered in the gorge during the January storm, along with her grandchildren. She had seen what Milo had built. She had watched her grandchildren survive when they might have frozen, and she had remembered. "I need to say something," she announced, standing in the middle of the social hall while her husband looked on with growing alarm. "About what happened last winter, about the Harwood place." The room went quiet. Cyrus stepped forward. "Margaret, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time." She looked around the room at the families who had sheltered with her, at the neighbors who had heard the stories, at her husband's face growing pale with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "My grandchildren are alive because of Milo Harwood. My grandchildren would have frozen to death in that storm if he hadn't taken us in. And my husband," she turned to face Cyrus directly, "my husband has spent the last year trying to destroy the man who saved our family. Margaret, he filed claims on the Gorge. He pressured storekeepers not to serve him. He told everyone who would listen that Harwood was a failure and a debtor and not to be trusted." Her voice was steady, but Milo could see her hands shaking. And all the while he knew. He knew where his grandchildren had survived. He knew what that place had done for this community, and he kept trying to take it away. The silence that followed was profound. Milo watched Dake's face cycle through expressions, fury, shame, calculation, and finally something that looked like exhaustion. The banker had spent his life managing other people's perceptions. Now his own wife had torn down the management in front of everyone who mattered. "I owed him money," Dake said finally. His voice was quiet, defensive. "He defaulted on a note. The law was on my side." "The law was on your side when you took his cattle and his house and his land. The law was on your side when you left him with nothing but an anvil and $38. But the law wasn't on your side when you tried to take what he built after that. Margaret's voice hardened. You weren't pursuing a debt, Cyrus. You were pursuing a grudge. Because he survived when you expected him to fail. Because he became useful when you wanted him to be worthless. Because he proved that everything you believe about money and power and control isn't the whole story. That's not. It is. And everyone in this room knows it. She looked around again, meeting eyes, gathering silent support. I'm not asking you to forgive him for what he owes. That's between you and whatever conscience you still have. But I'm telling you. She stepped closer to her husband. Well, no, I'm telling you that if you continue this campaign against a man who saved your grandchildren's lives, you will do it alone, because I will not stand beside you while you do it. She walked out of the social hall without looking back. After a long moment, her daughter-in-law followed, then her son, then several of the families who had sheltered in the gorge. Dake stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, watching his world rearrange itself around a man he had tried to destroy. The debt was settled in April. Not forgiven, Dake was not capable of forgiveness, not when money was involved. But settled through an arrangement that Milo would never have proposed, but was willing to accept. The terms were straightforward. Milo owed $2,400. Only he could not pay it in cash, would never be able to pay it in cash, not with the margins his work produced, but he could pay it in labor, specifically in consulting work for the bank's other debtors. Dake had holdings throughout the county, foreclosed properties, struggling claims, farms, and mines that produced just enough revenue to service their notes, but not enough to thrive. Many of these properties had the same problems Milo had faced: inadequate shelter, poor drainage, inefficient heating. If Milo could improve them, make them more productive, more survivable, more valuable, the bank would benefit, and the improvements would count against his debt at a rate of $50 per property until the balance was cleared. It's manipulative, Ada said when Milo explained it. He's using your skills to increase the value of his holdings. He is. And you're agreeing to it? I'm agreeing to clear the debt. The holdings will become more valuable, yes, but the people living on them will have better lives, warmer homes, less flooding, more productive work. He paused. Dake gets richer, but the families he's extracting from also benefit. It's not justice, but it's better than the alternative. What's the alternative? Fighting him for another decade while he finds new ways to make my life difficult. Watching him turn every success I have into evidence that I should be paying him more. Milo shook his head. I'd rather work off the debt and be free of him, even if working it off makes him money. The first property was a failing homestead east of Buffalo Gap, a family of 5 living in a frame house that leaked heat through every surface. Milo spent 3 days there designing improvements: earth banking against the north wall, a stone chimney in the center of the structure, a windlock on the main door, a root cellar properly sited to avoid flooding. The family did the labor themselves, following his instructions. By the end of the month, they reported the house was warmer, the food storage was dry, and they were using half as much firewood as before. $50 credited against the debt. 47 more properties to go, the years compressed. 1889 brought Ruth's 16th birthday and the first of Ada's guides into wider circulation. A printing house in Rapid City produced 500 copies of Practical Heating for Frontier Homes, and they sold within 2 months. The second printing sold faster. By the end of the year, homesteaders from Montana to Nebraska were reading Ada's distillation of Milo's methods. 1890 brought Perry's apprenticeship beginning in earnest. He had grown into the work gradually, but now he took it on formally. Long days at the forge, lessons in metallurgy and heat treatment, the slow accumulation of craft that would eventually make him a blacksmith in his own right. Samuel, the oldest apprentice, completed his training and opened his own shop in Deadwood, carrying the methods he had learned into a new community. 1891 brought the completion of Milo's debt to Dake. 48 properties improved, 48 families living better than before, 48 credits of $50 each against a balance that had once seemed impossible to clear. Dake signed the final release without comment, without acknowledgement, without meeting Milo's eyes. The banker had been diminished by his wife's public rebuke, by the community's quiet judgment, by the slow erosion of influence that came from being seen as petty rather than powerful. He was not ruined. Men like Dake were never truly ruined, but he was reduced. "Does it feel different?" Ada asked that evening, "being free of him?" "It feels like setting down something heavy. I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying until I stopped carrying it." "What will you do with the freedom?" Milo thought about it. "More of the same, I think. Teaching, building, making sure what Trigalis taught me doesn't disappear when I do." He looked at her. "And being present for what's happening here, for you, for Ruth and Perry, for whatever comes next." "That sounds right. It sounds ordinary." "Ordinary isn't bad." Ada smiled. "After everything you've survived, ordinary sounds like a gift." The century turned, and Milo Harwood was 60 years old. Ruth had married Owen Blevins' son, a carpenter who had learned construction principles from his father's collaboration with Milo. They lived in a house Ruth had designed herself, incorporating every innovation the two families had developed: central stone chimney, earth-banked walls, proper drainage, a windlock that had become standard throughout the county. Their first child, a daughter named Clara after Milo's first wife, was born in 1900. Perry ran the forge now. He had surpassed his father in technical skill years ago, developing refinements to the heat treatment processes that produced stronger, more durable tools. He had married the school teacher's niece, a young woman from Ohio who had come west to visit and stayed to build a life. Their children played in the same gorge where Perry had once hauled water as an 8-year-old, not knowing whether his family would survive the winter. Ada continued writing. The guides had multiplied, 12 volumes now, covering heating, water management, ventilation, food storage, and a dozen other practical topics. They circulated throughout the frontier, passed hand to hand, copied when originals wore out, becoming part of the informal curriculum that helped settlers survive in difficult country. She never took public credit for them. And the title pages read simply, "Compiled from the methods of M. Harwood, Custer County, Dakota Territory," and that was enough. The gorge itself had changed over 20 years. The original chamber, where 43 people had once sheltered through the worst storm in memory, was now just one section of a larger complex. A second chamber had been added to the east, connected by a stone-lined passage. A third served as a school during winter months, when families from throughout the county sent their children to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and the practical skills that Ada and Milo had systematized. The forges still ran, 3 of them now operated by Perry and his apprentices, but they were no longer the heart of the operation. Teaching was. "You've built something that will outlast you," Reuben Pike said one afternoon. He was old now, nearly 80, and he moved slowly on joints worn down by 50 years of freight hauling. But he still came to the gorge regularly, to watch the work, to remember what he had once doubted. "I've built something," Milo agreed. "Whether it outlasts me depends on whether people keep using it." "They will. Look around." Pike gestured at the compound, the chambers, the school, the families coming and going, the knowledge flowing outward into a community that no longer saw winter as a death sentence. "You changed how people think about surviving out here. That doesn't disappear when you do. That becomes part of how things are done." Trigalis said the same thing about what he taught me. And he was right. What he knew didn't die with him. It moved into you, and through you into everyone you've taught. Pike was quiet for a moment. I told you once that you'd die in that rock, that your children would freeze before January was out. I remember. I was wrong about everything, about the rock, about you, about what was possible. He looked at the gorge, the walls that had once seemed like a trap, now solid and warm, radiating the heat of decades of forge work. You didn't just survive in the stone, you made the stone work for you, and then you taught everyone else how to do the same. Anyone could have done it. No. Pike shook his head. Anyone could have tried. You're the one who did. Milo Harwood died on the 14th of February, 1916, in the chamber he had built to save his children's lives. He was 73 years old. He had outlived Clara by 39 years, which Trigalis by 28, Cyrus Dake by 7. He had seen Ruth raise 3 children and Perry raise 4. He had watched his method spread from one gorge to thousands of homes across the northern plains. He had held Ada's hand through her final illness 2 years before and buried her beside Clara on the ridge, where the morning sun hit first. In the end, he simply did not wake up. Perry found him in the rear alcove, wrapped in the same blankets that had kept him warm through that first impossible winter, his face peaceful, his work finally done. They buried him beside Ada and Clara and Trigalis, the 4th grave on the ridge overlooking the hills. Ruth spoke words about labor and love and the things that endure. Perry said nothing, but he went down to the forges afterward and worked iron for 6 hours straight, just letting the rhythm of the hammer say what his voice could not. The stone walls of the chamber, warmed by 3 decades of forge work, held their heat through the service and into the night. Within 5 winters of Milo Harwood's death, more than 24 communities across the northern plains had adopted some version of his methods. Earth-banked walls became standard in new construction. Central stone chimneys replaced iron stoves along exterior walls. Windlocks protected every entrance that faced the prevailing wind. Root cellars were sited for drainage first and convenience second. The word Harwood method entered local vocabulary, used by people who had never met him, but who understood that the phrase meant a particular approach to surviving in difficult country. Our freighters stopped calling it Harwood's Cave and started calling it Harwood's Warm Shop. The distinction mattered. A cave was a hole in the ground, a last resort, a place where desperate men went to hide. A warm shop was a working space, a place of production and learning, a center of gravity around which a community organized itself. Milo lived out his days beside the French Creek Gorge, with Ada, Ruth, Perry, and a changing ring of apprentices who carried his teachings into new territories. He never again measured himself by herd size, by land owned, by money in the bank. He measured himself by whether the fire was banked, the drain was clear, and the door shut tight before dark. He measured himself by whether the people who came to learn left knowing something useful. He measured himself by whether the stone was still warm in the morning. On a February night in 1916, the temperature dropped to 22 below zero. Snow rasped across the sod roof of the chamber where Milo Harwood lay still. 3 forges burned low in the main bay, their coals glowing faint orange in the darkness. Children slept in the rear alcove, warm against granite that was still giving back the day's heat. Reuben Pike had said the words in 1887, standing in the dusty main street of Custer City, certain of disaster. "Sleep in rock if you like, Harwood, but your children will die in it before January is out." 29 years later, Milo Harwood's grandchildren slept in that same rock, wrapped in blankets, breathing steady, safe from the cold that howled outside. The banker had taken the herd. He had taken the house. He had taken the land and the corrals and the barn with the new shingle roof. But he could not take the warm stone.